James was pacing the living room, his eyes darting nervously toward the clock on the wall. It was late, and Laura should have been home by now. She'd called earlier that evening, promising she'd be back soon after a quick dinner meeting with some colleagues. But as the minutes stretched into hours, his unease grew. It wasn't like her to be this late. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Laura. "I'm running late, babe. I'll be home soon. Love you." James tried to shake off the unease in his stomach. He told himself it was just work. She was always busy, always trying to climb higher in her career. But this wasn't like her. The more he thought about it, the more something felt off. He had noticed the changes over the past few months, the late nights, the occasional evasiveness, the way she would disappear into her phone whenever they were together, always making sure it was face down. James had pushed the thoughts away, telling himself it was just stress from work. But tonight, it felt different. He grabbed a glass of water and wandered into the study, looking for something to distract himself. As he sat down at the desk, his eyes wandered to Laura's bag resting on the chair by the door. It was odd that she had left it behind when she went out. The uneasy feeling inside him suddenly intensified, and before he could think twice, he found himself walking over to it. He knew it was wrong, browsing through her things, invading her privacy, but something told him to do it. He unzipped the bag, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside, he found what he wasn't ready for. His eyes fell on a folded-up piece of paper. It wasn't like Laura to leave notes or reminders in her bag, so he unfolded it carefully. It was a set of flight tickets. 2 of them. A flight to another country. And the name on the other ticket sent a chill down his spine. Chris Harris, professional athlete. James's mind went blank. He recognized the name. Chris Harris was a rising star in the sports world, a man Laura had been talking about more and more in recent months. But why would she have tickets with his name on them? Everything clicked into place in that moment. The late nights. The secrecy. The distance. His stomach turned as the realization hit him, his wife wasn't just working late. She was planning to leave him. And it was with him. James and Laura had been together for over 7 years. They met in their mid-20s, both starting fresh in a new city, far from their hometowns. He had been drawn to her energy, her ambition, and her warmth. She had been the life of every room they entered, charming, confident, and impossibly beautiful. They made a perfect match, or so it seemed. From the very beginning, their relationship was filled with excitement and promise. James admired Laura's drive. She was always determined to succeed in her career, determined to be the best version of herself. She pushed him to do better, to be better, and they had built a life together based on shared goals and aspirations. They had celebrated every milestone, from moving in together to their marriage 2 years ago. For the first few years, their relationship was the envy of their friends. They were always happy, always looking out for each other, finding new things to explore and enjoy. They loved the spontaneity of their weekends, the nights spent watching movies or going out to new restaurants. There was a connection between them that felt unshakable. But over time, things began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they grew apart. At first, it was small things. Laura became more focused on her work, taking on more projects, staying later at the office. James didn't mind, after all, they were both busy professionals. They had always understood each other's drive to succeed. He told himself that this was just a phase, a product of her wanting to advance in her career, a desire that he could respect. Still, there were moments that didn't feel right. Their conversations had started to shift from heartfelt exchanges to short, functional check-ins. They spoke about bills, appointments, and the mundane day-to-day things that came with maintaining a home. The laughter, the connection, the lightness that had once filled their home had started to fade. When Laura began traveling more frequently, James told himself it was just part of the job. But the calls were shorter, the texts more sporadic. She would often arrive home late, too tired to talk, sometimes too distracted by her phone to even notice him. James had asked her about it once, just before she left for what would be the last of many business trips. "Are you okay, babe?" he had asked one evening when she returned from a late meeting, her face weary and her mood distant. Laura smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, just work. You know how it is. I'm just really busy." She had brushed it off, the way she always did when he tried to talk about the emotional distance that was growing between them. In the back of his mind, James knew something was off, but he pushed those thoughts aside. He didn't want to admit that his wife, the woman he had built a life with, might be drifting away from him. He convinced himself that she was just in a stressful phase, that things would get back to normal. They always did, right? Laura's business trip to another city should have been nothing out of the ordinary. She had traveled for work many times before, and James had always supported her. He encouraged her to go, proud of her success, even though it meant being apart for a few days. This time, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the way she rushed out of the house that morning, her eyes avoiding his, the brief kiss she planted on his cheek before leaving. She was distant, almost cold. Or maybe it was the fact that this trip wasn't just a quick meeting, it was a few days, a full-blown conference where she would be staying in a hotel. She had made no mention of meeting anyone there, but James couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. At first, he tried to ignore the growing unease that clung to him like a second skin. He stayed busy with work, texting Laura occasionally, and keeping himself occupied. But the texts were brief, and the phone calls when she did call felt forced, like she was more interested in rushing through the conversation than engaging with him. She spoke about the conference, about the people she met, but there was always something guarded about her responses. When he asked how her day went, she'd give vague answers like, busy, but fine, or, a lot of meetings, not much else. The longer Laura stayed away, the more James began to feel a sense of isolation. The silence in their home was deafening. The routine had become monotonous. He had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes, but he began to question everything. Was she just too busy? Was she too tired to talk when she got back to the hotel? Or was there something more? One evening, a week into her trip, James found himself awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling. He had tried calling her earlier, but she hadn't answered. He'd left a message, but still hadn't heard back. That was when he noticed something strange. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, face down. He knew it wasn't a coincidence that she had left it there. He had never gone through her phone before, but in that moment, the temptation was too much to ignore. He picked it up, hesitated for a moment, and then unlocked it. He scrolled through her messages. At first, it was just mundane conversations with her coworkers and a few friends. But then he saw something that stopped him cold. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. "I can't wait to see you tonight, Laura. I miss you." His stomach lurched. Who was this? His heart raced as he clicked on the message, his hands trembling. There were more messages in the thread, all of them flirtatious, personal. The way they spoke to each other, there was an intimacy to it that went beyond a simple friendly exchange. His mind was spinning. This wasn't a colleague. It wasn't just a business connection. The messages were clear. His wife, his Laura, had been seeing someone else. Someone she hadn't told him about. Someone who clearly meant more to her than just a passing acquaintance. The realization was like a slap in the face. He dropped the phone back onto the counter, feeling numb. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just discovered. Was this a recent thing? Was it something that had been going on for a while? And who was this person, anyway? The name attached to the number, Chris Harris, meant nothing to him, but it felt like a key to a mystery he hadn't even begun to understand. The next morning, James barely slept. He had replayed the messages in his mind over and over, trying to make sense of everything. How could Laura do this? How could she betray him like this? But no answers came. He tried to push it out of his mind, to focus on the upcoming days, but the discovery lingered in his thoughts. Finally, the day came for Laura's return. James knew he should be happy to see her again, but the excitement he'd once felt now seemed hollow. He drove to the airport, feeling sick to his stomach as he thought about confronting her. What would he say? How could he even begin to address what he had found? When he arrived at the terminal, the first thing he saw was Laura. She was standing near the exit, her back turned to him. He watched her for a moment, noticing the way she was talking to someone else. A man. He was younger than James, dressed in athletic gear, his posture relaxed and casual. He couldn't see the man's face clearly, but the way they were standing together was undeniable. They were too close. They were laughing, talking in a way that made James feel like an outsider in his own life. Then it hit him. This was him, Chris. The man from the messages. James's breath caught in his throat as he approached them, trying to steady himself, trying to stay calm. But inside, everything was unraveling. The truth he had been avoiding was standing right in front of him, and there was no escaping it now. Laura, he said, his voice tight. She turned around, a smile quickly forming on her face. But it wasn't a smile of genuine happiness, it was forced, almost too practiced. Hey, babe, she said, her voice too cheerful. But there was no hiding the nervousness in her eyes. James couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of the betrayal crashing down on him. Before he could say anything else, Chris extended his hand toward him. Hey, man. I'm Chris, he said, his voice smooth, too comfortable. James couldn't even bring himself to shake his hand. Instead, he just stared at Laura, trying to keep his composure. The betrayal was laid bare, and the world around him suddenly felt too small. Laura, what the hell is going on? The airport terminal felt suffocating as the weight of the moment settled in. James stood frozen, his chest tight, eyes darting between Laura and Chris. His mind was reeling, but one thought kept repeating, how could she? Laura, who had once been the love of his life, was standing in front of him with Chris, the man who had been texting her behind his back, the man with whom she'd clearly been sharing more than just casual conversation. Her smile, the one that used to light up his world, now felt hollow. It was forced, like she was pretending, trying to maintain an illusion of normalcy. Chris, for his part, stood there looking like a deer caught in headlights. He extended his hand toward James, but the gesture felt utterly out of place, as if trying to mask the tension in the air. James didn't even look at his hand. His gaze was fixed on Laura, and the shock that had first gripped him was beginning to morph into something darker, rage, disbelief, and the sickening ache of betrayal. Laura, James said, his voice tight with restraint. What the hell is going on? Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, James saw something flicker in her expression, a hint of guilt, or perhaps fear. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by a carefully composed smile. James, what are you talking about? This is Chris, like I said. He's a colleague, a friend. She gestured toward Chris with a faint, almost dismissive motion, as if to downplay the gravity of the situation. James's pulse raced as he forced the words out. A colleague? A friend? His laugh was bitter, hollow. You've been planning to leave with him, Laura. I saw the flight tickets. I know everything. Her face faltered, the lie evaporating in an instant. The truth that had been lurking beneath the surface finally broke through. Chris glanced between them uncomfortably, clearly realizing that his presence had gone from casual to deeply inappropriate. But Laura didn't even seem fazed. She was still trying to control the situation, trying to justify the unexplainable. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Laura said, her voice quivering, but she wasn't looking at James. Her gaze was focused somewhere just past him, avoiding the truth. She stopped, her eyes flicking to Chris, and in that moment, James knew she had no intention of stopping. She wasn't looking for redemption, she was looking for a way to deflect blame. "Tell me the truth, Laura," James pressed, his voice dangerously calm. "How long has this been going on? Was I just some backup? Someone to settle for when things were easy? And then when the excitement wore off, you moved on?" Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration that her carefully constructed world was falling apart. She bit her lip, then turned to Chris, as if silently asking him to do something, to intervene. But Chris stayed silent, a mere spectator in the unfolding drama. I didn't want to hurt you, James," Laura said, her voice breaking. "But I've been unhappy. I've been feeling suffocated for a long time. This wasn't just about him, it was about me. I needed to feel alive again. I didn't know how to get that from you anymore." James's heart cracked at the words, but the pain quickly turned to anger. "You've been feeling suffocated?" His voice was rising now, the anger bubbling to the surface. "You never once came to me and said anything about this. You just," he choked back the words, unable to comprehend the depth of her betrayal. "You just went behind my back and started seeing someone else. And now you're telling me you want to run away with him?" Laura's face twisted as she reached out to touch his arm, but James pulled back. Her touch, which used to bring him comfort, now felt like poison. "I didn't plan for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know how to stop it once it had started." James's mind was spinning. He could hardly look at her anymore. The woman he had spent years with, the woman he thought he knew inside and out, was standing in front of him, telling him she had been planning to leave him for months, all while keeping him in the dark. And now, she was offering him nothing but excuses. "You didn't know how to stop it." James repeated, his voice barely a whisper, the disbelief and hurt cutting through. "You didn't think about how it would hurt me. You didn't think about everything we've built together." Laura's face crumpled as she finally broke down, her hands clutching the edge of the luggage trolley behind her for support. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could fix it, but I couldn't. I thought it would be okay to just leave for a while. But then I fell for him. I didn't know how to stop it." The finality in her words stung James more than he could ever have expected. She had fallen for someone else. And now, with no remorse, she was telling him everything he had feared, everything that had been eating away at him for weeks. The life he had built with her was a lie. He turned to Chris, his eyes now sharp with a cold fury. "And you? What's your role in this? You knew she was married. You knew what you were doing." His gaze was icy, and Chris shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his stare. But there was no apology, no remorse from Chris, only a defensive stance. "Look, man," Chris said, his voice defensive. "I didn't want things to get complicated. But we couldn't help it. I care about Laura, and she." "Enough," James cut him off, his voice a low growl. "You don't get to explain yourself to me. Not now." The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, the tension unbearable. James turned back to Laura, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger. "I trusted you. We built a life together. And you've been lying to me for months." He shook his head, disbelief still creeping into his voice. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Laura's tears were flowing freely now, but her regret felt hollow. She had made her choice. And now, standing there, the full weight of what had transpired hit James like a tidal wave. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "But I've made my choice, James. I'm leaving. I'm going to be with Chris. I love him." The words were final. The relationship was over. There was no bargaining, no second chances. The air between them was thick with the weight of the decision. James took a deep breath, his chest tight with a combination of emotions he couldn't quite process. Anger. Pain. Resentment. But underneath it all was something else, something colder. He was finally ready to let go. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Laura," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "But I'm done." He turned and walked away without looking back. The finality of his decision hit him harder than anything else. But it was the only way he could move forward. As he walked out of the airport, his mind began to clear. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain: he was done being someone's second choice. The door behind him slammed shut. And in that moment, everything had changed. James walked away from the scene, his heart still pounding in his chest, but a strange calmness settling over him with every step he took. The air felt cooler outside the terminal, and the weight of his own footsteps echoed in his mind. Each one felt like a declaration of something he had no choice but to face. His marriage had ended, not because of a single moment, but because of the slow erosion of trust, of love, of everything they once shared. And Laura, the woman he had married, had made that decision for him. As he moved through the parking lot and toward his car, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. He felt detached from the scene in a way that he couldn't explain. The confrontation with Laura, the betrayal, the rawness of it all, it had unfolded so quickly, yet it felt like it had been building for so long. He couldn't recall a single moment when things had truly gone wrong. It was all a blur of small decisions, little lies, and quiet moments of disconnection that had led to this. When he reached his car, he stopped. He just stood there for a while, staring at the ground, the cold night air brushing against his face. His hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but as his body calmed, his mind began to race. How did I not see this coming? He wondered. How did I miss the signs? But even as those questions swirled in his head, another thought crept in: maybe I didn't miss them. Maybe I just didn't want to see them. For so long, he had been clinging to the version of his marriage that existed in his head, the version that felt comfortable, familiar. But the truth had been there all along, right under the surface, in the late nights, the distant conversations, the missed connections. He had been too afraid to face it, to confront the fact that his wife had been slipping away. And now, it was too late. As he sat in his car, the keys cold in his hand, he couldn't help but think of the person he had become in the process. The man who had blindly trusted, the man who had clung to a love that was no longer real. Was he weak for letting it go on for so long? Or was he just human? Was anyone immune to betrayal? James leaned his head against the headrest, closing his eyes for a moment. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was quickly being replaced by something else, something deeper. The sense of betrayal was sharp, but it wasn't just about Laura. It was about himself, too. About the person he had become, about the life they had built that had been so easily shattered. Could he ever rebuild? The next morning, when the rush of emotions began to fade, he sat in his apartment, staring at the silence around him. The space that had once been filled with laughter, conversations, and dreams for the future now felt cold, empty, and hollow. The weight of his own thoughts was overwhelming. His phone buzzed a few times. Laura had sent several texts, all apologetic, all full of regret. She said she was sorry. She said she still loved him. But James didn't want to read her apologies. The damage was already done. Instead, he opened his email, finding a message from his boss, asking if he could meet to discuss a new project. He scrolled through the subject line, his finger hovering over the message. But it didn't feel like it mattered. Everything felt like it was on pause. The future seemed too uncertain, too fragile. As he sat there, staring blankly at the screen, he thought about what came next. Did he keep fighting for something that was already gone? Did he try to salvage what was left of his marriage? Or did he walk away, accept the end, and rebuild something new from the rubble? What was more painful, the idea of fighting for someone who had already chosen another path, or walking away and letting the relationship fade into the past. His phone buzzed again, a message from a friend asking if he wanted to grab a drink later. He stared at the message, thinking about how easy it would be to lose himself in a conversation, in a drink, in the company of someone who didn't know his pain. He could do that. He could pretend it wasn't happening. He could distract himself from the grief and anger that he didn't yet know how to process. But would that make him feel better? Would it bring back the love he had lost, the trust he had built his world around? The answer was clear, and yet it left him feeling more uncertain than ever before. Maybe the answer was simply time. Maybe he needed to take a step back, to stop looking for quick fixes, to stop trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense at all. And so, for the first time in a long while, James took a deep breath and turned his phone off. He didn't want to deal with any more messages, any more questions. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He needed space. He needed time to think. What had happened to him, to his marriage, was a painful lesson. But perhaps the most painful part wasn't the betrayal, it was the realization that sometimes, you have to let go, even when you don't want to. Sometimes, the future isn't something you can control, no matter how hard you try. James stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't keep holding on to the past. As the sun set outside his apartment, the world seemed to stand still. And James, for the first time in what felt like forever, was left with only one question: what comes next?